Hey guys, tonight we're starting with something quiet, almost deceptively gentle, the very first letter home from a young soldier. Imagine sitting in your room, maybe with a mug of tea that's just warm enough to fog your glasses. When the post finally arrives, the envelope is thin, the ink smudged, and there's a faint trace of camp dust clinging to the paper. This isn't the kind of letter you frame though. It's the kind you read once, fold carefully, and tuck away because you can already feel the weight in the words. He talks about a cough, nothing more at first, just a few boys in his unit waking with a scratch in their throats. You might think, oh, big deal, happens every winter. But then you remember, in his time, there's no miracle syrup, no box of tissues, just the slow realization that something is passing between them. You'd probably last about 3 days out there before begging to be sent home. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And, as always, drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's oddly satisfying to picture the map lighting up in my head. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The letter begins simply, "Dear Mother," and right there you can almost hear the tremor in his hand as he writes. He's not the kind of man who shares much about the cold or the food, but he spends 2 whole paragraphs on this cough. At first, it's described almost like a prank. Soldiers coughing at night, waking others, groaning when teased. But then, the tone shifts. More men are coughing, and the sound isn't sharp and dry anymore. It's heavy, wet, the kind that shakes the ribs and leaves you gasping. You picture him pausing mid-sentence, perhaps looking over his shoulder as if the sound has followed him even to the writing desk. He writes about the camp in late summer, when the heat still clings to the canvas of the tents and makes the air inside stale. The soldiers sleep close together, blankets overlapping, boots lined up like obedient schoolchildren. In such cramped quarters, a cough doesn't just belong to one man. It drifts, it settles in lungs that were fine the day before. By the 2nd week, he says, the jokes about camp cough have stopped. No one's laughing when Private Ellis spends 2 full days in his cot, sweating through his sheets and mumbling in fever dreams about his father's farm. It's a familiar rhythm in history, an illness arriving quietly, dressed up as something harmless. We know now that this is the opening act of what will later be called the Spanish flu, though at the time the name hadn't yet stuck. The popular story is that it spread from camp to camp through troop movements. But here's a lesser-known detail. Some military doctors in 1918 suspected it started in the dust and manure of Midwestern training bases, carried not by foreign ships, but by the boots of farm boys turned recruits. The letter doesn't say that, of course. He's just noticing that the cough doesn't seem to care whether you're from Boston or Kansas. One night, he writes, the coughing wakes him again. But this time it's accompanied by the soft creak of a cot as someone is helped to the infirmary. The air outside is cool and damp, the kind that makes breath visible. He stands at the tent flap and counts the silhouettes moving in the dark. 1, 2, 3. There's a moment where you feel his hesitation, as though he's deciding whether to follow them or to stay put and pretend nothing's happening. Historians still debate, he writes. Yes, he actually uses those words, probably repeating something a chaplain said, whether this sickness is worse than the fevers. We've always known, but I can tell you it feels different. You can almost hear him scratching that last part into the paper a little harder. He tells his mother not to worry, the way soldiers do when they're already worried themselves. He promises to keep washing his hands, though in camp that means a tin basin and a rag that's been used by 6 other men. He jokes about wearing a scarf to bed, as if that would keep the germs away. That's his first joke in the whole letter, and you can feel the effort behind it, like someone whistling in the dark. By the final paragraph, he's run out of room at the bottom of the page, so his writing slants upward. He says there, expecting new recruits next week, and the officers are debating whether to send the sick men to a separate tent or to just tough it out in place. You know now, with the cruel clarity of hindsight, that toughing it out is a disaster waiting to happen. But he's not thinking about global pandemics or mortality rates. He's thinking about the fact that his bunkmate hasn't eaten in 2 days, and the man who plays harmonica in the evenings can no longer sit up without coughing. When you set the letter down, you can almost feel the camp pressing in, the smell of canvas and sweat, the faint sweetness of pipe smoke, the background chorus of throats clearing in the night. You understand why he wrote when he did, before things got worse, before letters home would start to carry news that no mother wanted to read. And maybe, just maybe, you keep the envelope close by, as though holding onto his words could somehow keep him safe. That's how the first letter ends, with an attempt at reassurance that fools neither of you. You fold it back along its worn creases, knowing this is only the beginning, and the cough he's describing has already travelled farther than the post that brought you his words. You're still holding that first letter in your mind when the next one arrives, thinner paper this time, as if the camp has run short of good stationery. The edges are slightly curled, and there's a faint sour scent that reminds you of damp wool. He starts with small talk, as though easing you in. The weather has cooled. They've been drilling in the rain, and someone managed to fix the camp's coffee pot. But then, between lines about mud and meals, the real story creeps in. He writes about whispers. Not the kind exchanged over mess hall stew, but the kind traded after lights out, when the barracks is wrapped in darkness and everyone's pretending to sleep. The rumors are small at first. A man in the next company who can't catch his breath. A boy in the supply tent who coughed so hard he fainted. You imagine these hushed conversations threading through the rows of bunks, voices barely above a breath, the way secrets travel in the dark. There's something almost childish about it, like ghost stories told under blankets, except here the ghost is real and has a cough. He describes the barracks in the hours after the lamps are doused. The air turns still, but the wood beneath the beds creaks with every shift of weight. Somewhere in the dark, someone coughs, and the sound ricochets through the quiet like a pebble tossed into a well. A few men stir, pretending they weren't already awake. Others bury their faces deeper into blankets, as though cotton can keep fear at bay. By the second week, the whispers have sharpened names of men who've been sent to the infirmary. Speculation about who will be next. The popular history books tell you that military discipline kept soldiers from panicking. But here's a lesser-known truth. Fear has its own chain of command. It doesn't need orders to move. It passes along the bunks like a contraband cigarette. One breath, one lean closer, one muttered, "Did you hear?" And though no one admits it aloud, each man has already imagined himself coughing into the crook of his arm, wondering how fast the sickness spreads. One night, he writes, the whispers take a sharper turn. A man at the far end claims he saw a medic carry out a blanket-covered shape after midnight. Might have been a man, someone says. Might have been supplies. Another mutters, The truth stays hidden under layers of rumor, like a coin at the bottom of a muddy puddle. He jokes lightly, but you can feel the weight under it, that if the illness doesn't get them, the speculation might. At least he writes, nobody's saying it's ghosts anymore. But there's one line that stops you, historians. We'll argue one day about whether we knew too much or too little in these nights, but I think knowing halfway is the worst. He means the space between certainty and ignorance, where the imagination fills in the blanks with things more frightening than fact. He tells you the men have started sleeping with their boots on, not because they expect to be called for a drill, but because no one wants to be caught stumbling barefoot to the infirmary. He doesn't say it outright, but you can tell they've all noticed how quickly the sickness moves from bunk to bunk, as if it knows the order of their names on the roster. By the end of the letter, he circles back to safe topics. The coffee pot still works, and someone found a deck of cards missing, only one jack. But the words feel like the whistle at the end of a horror film, a forced cheerfulness layered over the sound of coughing in the dark. You fold this letter more carefully than the last, because you're beginning to suspect the next one will be harder to read. The envelope arrives stiff with dried grit, its flap half torn as if it had been opened and resealed somewhere along the way. The paper inside is stiff, too, warped into ripples by dampness, long since dried. When you unfold it, a faint shower of brown dust drifts onto your lap, trench mud, clinging to the creases like a stubborn shadow from another world. It smells faintly of iron and earth, the way old coins do when you hold them too long in your palm. The handwriting starts neatly enough at the top, though the ink has bled in places where raindrops must have fallen. But as the lines descend, the letters begin to tilt, swell, and tremble. It's not sloppy, it's strained, like every stroke is an effort. He doesn't mention a fever at first. Instead, he talks about the trenches themselves, about the way mud seeps into everything, boots, blankets, the lining of your coat, even the bread in your ration tin. He jokes that mud has replaced sugar in his tea, and wonders aloud if the army will issue spoons for it soon. But between these dry jokes, there's a change in rhythm. You can feel him pausing more often to dip the pen, not because the ink has run out, but because his hand has slowed. He admits, finally, that the cough hasn't left him. It rattles in his chest during the day and wakes him at night, leaving his mouth dry and his head heavy. And yet, he insists, it's nothing, just the cold, damp air working its way in. You picture him hunched over a crate serving as a desk, the candlelight too dim for the corners of the page, the nib scratching unevenly as his hand shakes. There's a strange intimacy in holding these sheets, the same paper that once rested under his palm, catching the warmth of his skin even as fever crept through it. You can almost hear the cough interrupting his sentences, his pen pausing mid-word until he regains enough breath to continue. There's one blot of ink so large it obscures half a word. He's drawn an arrow to the margin where he's rewritten it, sleep. It's unclear whether he meant to reassure you that he's getting some, or if he's wishing you would. Here's the part you don't read in school books, Trench. Mud wasn't just mud. It was a mixture of rainwater, churned soil, spilled coffee, ash from cigarettes, and sometimes faintly, horribly, the decay of things left too long in the open. He doesn't say that in the letter, but you can see it in the uneven smudges where his wrist dragged across the page, midway through. There's a sentence you read twice. The cough moves faster than the rain. It's not poetic flourish. It's fact. Men are going to sleep beside each other and waking up apart, one in the trench, the other in the field hospital. Historians will argue about whether the mud made us sick or just carried the sickness. He writes, but either way, it follows us like a shadow. By the end, the handwriting is so thin you have to hold the page close to read it. He apologizes for cutting the letter short, says his hands are cold, and the candle is guttering low. The last line is oddly sweet. Tell the cat I'd trade my boots for her purr right now. You fold the paper back into its battered envelope, mud flakes falling onto the table. And you can't help thinking how many more letters will arrive like this, if they arrive at all. Night in the barracks is never truly silent, even before the sickness. You'd hear the low shuffle of boots against wooden floors, the creak of a cot frame as someone turned in their sleep, the occasional muffled laugh from a card game gone on too long. But now there's a different kind of sound, threading through the dark, sharper, wetter, and impossible to ignore. The letter begins with that sound. He writes that the first cough comes just after lights out, hacking its way into the stillness like a stone thrown through glass. Then another, from the far end of the room, and another, closer this time, until the air feels thick with it. He describes lying there, pulling the blanket tighter around himself, counting the seconds between each fit. One cough, pause, two coughs. Pause, the rhythm jagged and uneven. He tries to joke about it, saying the barracks sound like a chorus of geese badly out of tune, but the humor doesn't stick. You can feel his unease seep through the paper. He says the sound keeps him awake more than the damp or the cold, not just because it's loud, but because each cough feels like a warning. You can't see it, but you can almost feel the sickness moving, invisible, untouchable, yet somehow brushing past in the dark. He explains that during the day, the men try to ignore it. They tell each other it's just the weather, or the smoke from the stoves, or a tickle in the throat from talking too much. But at night, with no cards to play, no work to distract them, the cough takes on a shape of its own. Every breath feels heavier, he writes. It's the quiet between the coughs that's worse. That's when I wonder who'll be next. There's one detail, he adds, that you've never thought about before, how the cough doesn't just wake the sick man. It wakes the ones sleeping beside him, and they turn away instinctively, pulling blankets over their faces. In the flicker of lamplight, you can see that tiny, cruel moment of separation. No one says they're afraid, but no one wants to be touched either. Somewhere in the middle of the letter, he mentions Private Dawson. He coughed until his voice was gone. He writes, then coughed in silence, mouth open but no sound. They moved him to the far cot by the door. By morning, the cot was empty. He doesn't say where Dawson went, and you don't ask. Here's the strange truth you don't see in recruitment posters. Sickness didn't march in with banners and drums. It slipped in on boots and sleeves, clung to hands and breath, and made its announcements in the dark hours when men were too tired to fight it. Historians still debate whether these early barracks outbreaks could have been stopped if the men had been separated sooner. But reading his words, you get the feeling it was already too late by the time the first lamp was lit. Near the end, the handwriting wavers as if he's writing from his cot, pen propped against a knee under the blankets. He admits he's started coughing too, says it's probably nothing, just to keep me in tune with the rest of the choir. He adds a little arrow pointing to that sentence with the word joking in parentheses. But you can tell it's only half a joke. The last line is short. If I don't write tomorrow, It's because I finally slept. You put the letter down, but the sound of that coughing lingers in your ears, a restless echo that feels too close, too alive to belong to a page. The envelope is smaller than the ones from the front, the paper thinner, the handwriting rounder and more deliberate. You can almost smell the kitchen where it was written, faint flour, dust, a bit of stove smoke clinging to the folds. Her letter begins the way mothers do, with questions you can't answer in writing. Are you warm enough? Are you eating well? Do you sleep through the night? Then, in the second paragraph, the tone shifts. She says there's talk in town of a sickness moving up from the city. At first, they thought it was just gossip, the kind of rumor that bounces between market stalls and church steps. But now, Mrs. Keating down the road hasn't opened her curtains in 3 days. The postman wears a scarf over his mouth, and this morning, the grocer's boy collapsed halfway through a delivery. She describes it simply: fevers that climb too fast, skin turning the color of spoiled milk, a cough that leaves people breathless and unable to stand. She writes, "We had hoped the distance would keep us safe, but it seems the world is smaller than we thought." You can feel the truth of that in her words, the same truth you've seen in the barracks, in the way illness ignores fences and oceans and all the polite borders. People try to draw. There's a detail she slips in without dwelling on it. The church bells rang twice yesterday for the first time in months, one after the other. Funerals now happen quickly, quietly, sometimes without a minister, just neighbors lowering a plain wooden box into the ground. She doesn't say whose. Maybe she's sparing you. Maybe she knows you'll find out anyway. She tells you the doctor's wife has taken to boiling vinegar in their house, swearing it keeps the air clean. Others are stuffing camphor into handkerchiefs, carrying the sharp smell with them like a shield. She remembers you hated the smell of camphor when you were small, always wrinkling your nose, and she jokes that maybe that's why you've been spared so far, because the flu can't stand your stubbornness either. Still, beneath her careful humor, you can read the worry she doesn't write outright. The ink darkens where she's pressed harder, as if holding the pen more tightly could keep you safe. She says the Sunday school has been suspended until further notice, and the mayor has forbidden gatherings in the square. She hasn't been to see your aunt in a week, though she can wave from the end of the lane. She closes with the usual lines that she prays for you each night, that she keeps your letters in the top drawer beside her bed. But then, almost as an afterthought, she adds, "Write soon. The days feel longer now, and I'd like to know your voice is still there on the page." You fold the letter back into its envelope, but her words don't fold away so neatly. The distance between you feels stretched thin, not by miles, but by something invisible threading through both your worlds, here in the barracks and there. In the small rooms of home, historians still debate whether towns like hers were doomed the moment soldiers passed through on leave, or whether the sickness would have found them no matter what. But her letter makes you think it doesn't really matter once it starts. It's already everywhere. The paper smells faintly of coal dust, as if the letter had soaked it in during the journey. His words come to you in a shaky hand, the penmanship. Wondering where the train must have jolted under him, he writes from a troop carriage heading toward the front. The kind of narrow wooden compartment you've seen in photographs, benches too close together, luggage racks sagging above, the air so thick with bodies that it tastes like someone else's breath. He says the journey began before dawn, soldiers tumbling aboard in a muddle of rifles, bedrolls, and the kind of optimism people still have before they reach the real fighting. The windows are clouded with condensation, And every few minutes someone wipes a circle clear to see the grey blur of countryside passing. But in between the rattle of wheels and the whistle's mournful cry, there's another sound threading its way through the carriage, coughing, short, sharp bursts at first, scattered like dropped coins, then more, overlapping, until you can't tell who coughed first or how many are sick. The rumour mill starts before they've even cleared the station. One soldier swears he heard about an entire regiment laid up with fever. Another claims it's just the winter chill, though he keeps his scarf pulled high over his mouth. Someone in the back says his cousin back home buried 2 neighbours in the same week, and you can feel the words ripple through the compartment like a sudden draught. Nobody asks for proof in a space this cramped. Doubt doesn't stand a chance. He writes about the food, hard bread that tastes of the paper it's wrapped in, tea so weak you can see the bottom of the tin cup. Between bites, the men swap stories, some real, some surely invented, just to keep the fear at bay. There's a private with a laugh too big for the carriage, who claims he's immune to any illness because he once swallowed a coin and came out richer. Another fellow suggests they should all hold their breath for the rest of the ride, which earns a chorus of groans and a muttered, "We'd suffocate before the flu gets us." Somewhere near the border, the train slows for a crossing, and through the smeared glass they see a station platform dotted with civilians. Most stand back, keeping their distance, scarves tied across their faces. A few wave weakly, as though unsure whether this is a send-off or a warning. He notices a child tugging at his mother's skirt, eyes wide, mouth hidden. The image stays with him, the strange politeness of fear, how it makes people smaller, quieter. The hours grind on, each mile marked by the clack of the wheels and the scrape of boots shifting restlessly. He writes that the air has grown warmer, heavier, the mix of breath and coal smoke making every inhale an effort. Someone opens a window and the rush of cold cuts through the carriage, stirring up coughs and muttered curses. A few men start wearing their greatcoats indoors, as if more layers might keep sickness out. There's a moment he lingers on, a soldier across the aisle, barely more than a boy, whose hands tremble as he holds a letter from home. The boy reads it once, then again, lips moving silently, before folding it away like something fragile. He catches your soldier's eye and smiles. But it's the kind of smile you give when you don't want someone to see the fear underneath. By nightfall, the carriage is a shadowy tunnel, lit only by a few dim lamps swinging with the motion. The voices are lower now, some men dozing with their heads against the rattling walls, others whispering about the front, about whether the enemy is worse than the fever. He writes that in the dark, the coughs sound louder, closer, almost deliberate, like they're reminding everyone there's no outrunning what's already aboard. He doesn't say it outright, but you can read it between the lines. The train isn't just carrying men and rifles. It's carrying something invisible, something that seeps into the fabric of their uniforms and the cracks in their skin. Historians still debate whether these crowded troop trains were the true arteries of the pandemic, pumping illness from one end of the country to the other faster than any telegram. But on that ride, it wouldn't have mattered. The destination was the same, closer to the front, closer to the sickness, closer to whatever waited in the dark beyond the next bend of the track. And still, he writes, there's a strange comfort in the rhythm of the wheels, a steady beat under all the fear and chatter. It's the same sound that will carry him to where letters become fewer, the same sound you now hear in your head as you fold his page, closed, a reminder that sometimes movement feels like progress, Even when you're not sure where it's taking you, the envelope feels lighter this time, as if the weight has been scraped out of it. When you unfold the paper, your eyes catch on the blunt interruptions, thick black lines slashing across sentences like stubborn shadows. The ink is not the same as his handwriting. It's heavier, deliberate, the sort that doesn't fade. With age, your soldier writes from somewhere near the front, but you wouldn't know exactly where. The name of the place is gone, swallowed under censor's ink. You run your finger over the first blacked-out strip. The texture is slightly raised, as though the censor pressed hard enough to make sure nothing could slip through. You imagine a man at a wooden desk in some cramped office, a stack of letters to his right, a bottle of ink at his elbow, reading each word with a frown before dipping his pen and crossing out whatever might cause alarm. It's an odd sort of intimacy, a stranger's hand passing over a soldier's private thoughts before they ever reach the person they were meant for. What survives between the lines is disjointed but vivid. He describes the mornings, damp, blankets, boots lined up like tired soldiers themselves, and the strange quiet before orders come down. There's a half-finished sentence about a comrade who, and then the ink eats the rest. Another about the food situation. The words we've run out of are all that's left before another blackout. You piece together what you can, like someone reconstructing a dream after waking. And yet, even in fragments, his voice still comes through. He writes about a card game that went on for 3 nights straight. How one man won so much tobacco he started trading it for buttons, just to keep the pile interesting. He mentions the weather, the way the fog wraps around the camp until you can't tell whether it's morning or dusk. But then there's another gap, a whole paragraph gone, and the next surviving words are he didn't make it through the night. Historians still debate whether these military censors were more concerned with protecting morale at home, or with hiding the sheer scale of sickness from their own ranks. Either way, the effect is the same for you. A letter that feels like a puzzle missing all the most important pieces. You're left to fill in the blanks yourself, and the human mind has a way of making the missing parts worse than anything written. He tries to slip things past them. You can tell. There's a sentence about the quiet that follows the cough, left untouched, perhaps because it's too vague to mean much to the censor, but you can hear the weight in it. Another time, he writes of a comrade gone to the long rest instead of dead, and this euphemism survives the pen's blade. In a way, these little survivors make you trust him more. He's telling you what he can, even if the truth has to be smuggled in sideways. You imagine the other letters in that same stack, each one carved up and stitched back together in someone else's order. Whole paragraphs about shortages of quinine, gone. Lists of names, gone. Mentions of troop illness, gone. It's like looking at a photograph where everyone's face has been painted over. You can still see the uniforms, the hands, the posture, but the identity is gone. The strangest part is how it forces you to notice the empty space. The black lines don't blend into the page. They jump out at you, daring you to guess what's underneath, and you do guess. You imagine he's telling you about the man in the bunk beside him, the one who started coughing after lights out and never woke again. Or maybe it's about the nurse who's been working 3 shifts without sleep, who stopped showing up one morning. The more you read, the more the letter feels like a conversation with 2 voices, your soldiers and the censors, silent interruptions. You find yourself wondering if the man with the ink pot felt anything at all as he crossed things out. Was it tedious? Did his hand cramp after 100 letters? Or did he read something once in a while that stayed with him, that made him hesitate? For just a second before the pen came down. There's a part near the end where your soldier seems almost to mock the system. He writes, "Today was much like yesterday, except for the black line and the black line, which of course I am not permitted to describe." The censor let it through, perhaps thinking it meaningless, but you can hear the smirk in it. Even stripped of detail, the humor is still there. The human resistance to being silenced. By the time you reach his closing, you realize the letter is shorter than usual. Maybe he didn't want to give them too much to erase, or maybe he was too tired to write more. He signs it simply with his first name, though even that has a loop of ink drawn through the last letter, perhaps not to hide his identity from you, but from anyone else who might read it. You fold the page back into its envelope, but the black marks linger in your mind. They're more than just absences. They're proof there's something happened worth hiding, something that moved through the camp fast enough to frighten those in charge, something that could topple more than just bodies if the wrong people knew. And as you sit there with the letter on your lap, you realize that sometimes what you're not told says more than the words you get to keep. You notice it right away. The handwriting is tighter, more hurried, as if the pen itself is keeping pace with something urgent happening beyond the page. The letter begins not with the usual small talk about weather or card games, but with a scene so vivid you can almost smell it, the barracks. Once noisy with boots and banter, now hushed except for the rasp of labored breathing, your soldier explains that they've pushed all the bunks to the walls and dragged in cots from anywhere they could find, supply sheds, nearby farms, even borrowed from another unit's sleeping quarters. The once orderly rows of beds are now crammed into every corner. A place built for rest after drills has become something else entirely, a place where rest is the hardest thing to find. The smell of antiseptic mixers with damp wool and the faint, sweet rot of illness. Lanterns hang from the beams, their light, dim and yellow, throwing tired shadows across the room. Nurses, some trained, others just women from nearby towns, pressed into service, move between the cots like ghosts in white aprons. You can almost hear their footsteps soft against the wooden floors, the quiet murmur of them coaxing water into parched mouths, the rustle of sheets being adjusted for comfort that never lasts. He tells you there's no real separation between the living and the dying here, just a cot's width, a thin blanket, and a few hours of time. In one sentence, he describes waking in the night to a sudden stillness beside him, the kind of silence that feels wrong, heavier than the darkness. They carry them out before dawn, he writes, so we don't start counting. The line sits there between your fingers, and you wonder how many more will be gone before morning. Historians still debate whether the army ever truly intended these makeshift hospitals to save lives, or if they were simply places to contain the sick, until the fever decided the outcome. Either way, your soldier describes a place stretched so far beyond its limits that the walls seem to bend with the weight of it. Even the healthy aren't untouched. He says the coughs move faster than the medics can keep up, spreading down the row of cots like a whispered rumor. One man at the far end had been sitting up at breakfast, and by evening his bunk was empty, his pillow already claimed by another feverish head. There is no ceremony here, no final words, just an exchange of space, one body for another. There's a strange, bitter humor in some of his lines, the kind of jokes soldiers tell because the alternative is staring too long at the truth. He writes about a nurse who told him she now dreams of coughs. waking in the night, thinking she hears one and reaching for a water cup before remembering she's off duty. Another time, he describes a man who, delirious with fever, insisted on trying to salute every time she walked past. If politeness could cure the flu, he writes, he'd have been up and marching by now. But between the jokes, you can read his exhaustion. He's not sick yet, or so he says, but the work of lifting, feeding, and sometimes simply sitting with the dying has worn him thin. He admits that sometimes, when the room is full of coughing, he finds himself holding his own breath without realizing it, as if that might keep the sickness from finding him. The letter lingers on the sound of the place. The barracks used to have a rhythm, boots at dawn, clatter at mess, the rattle of cards on a wooden crate. Now it's a chorus of coughing, the splash of water in basins, the occasional muffled sob when someone can't take it quietly anymore. Outside, the world keeps moving. Horses pulling supply wagons, the wind in the canvas walls, the rumble of distant artillery. But inside, time feels different, stretched, slowed, measured, not in hours, but in the rise and fall of chests. He ends with a detail you can't quite shake. In the corner, someone has tacked up a small piece of paper with a verse scribbled on it. This too shall pass. He doesn't say whether it's meant as comfort or a warning, only that the edges are curling from the damp, and every time someone coughs near it, the paper trembles on its pin. When you fold the letter closed, you realize the transformation he described isn't just about the barracks. It's in the soldiers, two men who once only thought of the front, now counting spoons, of medicine, wringing out wet cloths, whispering to strangers in the dark. The war hasn't paused for this illness. It has simply made another battlefield, one without trenches or rifles, but with just as many casualties. The letter arrives folded into an envelope already softened at the edges, as though it's been handled too often before reaching you. Inside, the handwriting carries a lighter tone than the last few you've read, almost like the ink itself is stretching, reaching for a brighter day. Your soldier starts by telling you about a rare afternoon of sun, the kind of light that spills across the ground and makes even mud look like gold. Somewhere between drills and the evening meal, a battered football appeared. Nobody's quite sure from where, and suddenly the air in camp shifted. Boots were unlaced, jackets thrown onto piles, and someone used a tin mug to mark the goal. It wasn't organized, not really. Sides were chosen with the lazy democracy of whoever was standing closest when the ball was dropped. He writes that for those first few minutes, the war seemed to loosen its grip. There was laughter that didn't have an edge to it, and shouts that weren't warnings. Even the officers paused to watch, leaning against the doorway with arms folded, pretending they weren't smiling. The game itself was scrappy. The ball bounced strangely on the uneven ground, and half the players seemed more interested in wrestling each other than scoring. But it was a kind of chaos everyone welcomed. Then the cough came. One man bent over to catch his breath and didn't straighten again. At first, they thought he'd taken a bad knock. But then the coughing began in earnest, deep and raw, like something being pulled from his chest. They carried him to the side, and within the hour, 2 more players had left the field. The game limped on for a while, quieter now, but it ended before anyone could call a winner. Historians still debate moments like these, whether they were acts of resilience or desperate attempts to pretend nothing had changed. Your soldier doesn't seem to care about the answer. He writes about the way the light faded across the pitch, and how even as they packed the ball away, there was a strange reluctance to let go of that brief stretch of normal. Between the lines, you can sense how much weight he gives to that hour. He says it reminded them all of home, of Saturdays in small fields, of brothers and cousins shouting at each other over whether the ball had crossed the line. Someone joked that they should send the winning side to face the enemy, since we're already good at running. Another replied that the losing side was already coughing, so they'd be no use anyway. There's laughter in the telling, but it's the thin, careful kind by the end of the letter. The football is back in its hiding place, its leather patched and scuffed, waiting for a day when it might roll across the dirt again. But your soldier admits he doesn't know if that will happen. The men who'd played the hardest are now lying in the converted hospital space you read about before, their boots tucked neatly under the cots as if they might still need them, and yet he writes that one game was worth it, even if it was cut short, even if it ended without a score. It gave them something the barracks walls and the sound of coughing couldn't touch. For a little while, they weren't soldiers or patients, just men chasing a ball under an open sky. The next letter comes heavier, as if the paper itself has absorbed the weight of what's written inside. The handwriting is uneven, slanting more than usual, and there are places where the ink fades, not from age, but from a tired hand lifting off mid-stroke. Your soldier wastes no time in telling you what's happened. One morning, the camp woke to the sound of silence. No boots stomping in the yard, no barked orders, no metallic clatter of mess tins. At first you think perhaps it's a rare day of rest. Then he explains, entire companies are sick. Not a few lads under the weather sick, but every bunk in some barracks occupied by men too weak to stand. The marches are cancelled. The carefully printed duty rosters, usually covered in names and shifts, are now blank sheets pinned to the wall. The army doesn't run on blank spaces, but here they are, staring back like an unanswered question. Even the officers are quiet, moving slower. Speaking in half phrases, he describes the smell, a mix of damp wool, stale air, and something sharp in the throat, like the temps before a fever truly takes hold. You can hear him searching for the right words. He says the air in the barracks feels thicker, as though breathing requires more effort, and the silence is broken only by coughing fits that ripple from one end of the room to the other. There's a moment in the letter when he tries to count the healthy men left in his unit, and he stops mid-sentence. Either the number was too small to write, or he didn't want to put it down in ink, as if naming it would make it real. Historians still debate whether these mass outbreaks were due to the close quarters, the chill damp of autumn, or something the men carried from camp to camp like invisible luggage. And yet, in the middle of it all, he notes the strange routines that survive. One man insists on polishing his boots daily, even if he's coughing so hard he has to pause every few minutes. Another still shaves each morning, his hand shaking so much he nicks his chin, but never skips a day. It's as if these small acts are a way of saying, we're still here. We're still us. Your soldier admits he's been lucky so far, though the word lucky feels too fragile to hold. He's seen strong men carried out on stretchers, their blankets wrapped tight to stop the shivering. Some of them don't come back. Others do, but with eyes that seem to look past you, as if they're still hearing something you can't buy. The end of the letter, he tells you about the mess hall. Half the benches are empty, and the food is served without chatter. Even the bread seems smaller, though he says that might just be in his head. There's a kind of hush hanging over the camp now, not the peace of safety, but the waiting before a storm kind. And he closes with a single line, one that you can almost hear in his voice. If you don't get my next letter on time, It's probably just because the whole world's gone to bed. The envelope is thinner than the rest, and when you hold it up to the light, the paper seems almost translucent, as if the words inside are barely clinging to it. You break the seal gently, half afraid the page will tear, and unfold a single sheet. The handwriting starts steady enough, the same loops and careful angles. You've come to know from all his earlier letters. He begins with the weather, as he often does. Says the mornings are so damp, the canvas of the tents clings to itself, and the cold bites through wool like teeth. He talks about the men playing cards in a corner of the barracks, their voices low so as not to wake those sleeping in the makeshift cots. A cough interrupts the game now and then, but nobody remarks on it anymore. Coughing has become as common as breathing. He shifts to describing the food, or rather, the lack of it. The bread is harder, the broth thinner. We chew and swallow like it's a habit, not a meal, he writes, with a touch of humor, as though making a joke will soften the reality. He tells you about Corporal Harris, who swears the kitchen is watering down the soup with rainwater. If that's true, your soldier says, then at least the rain here is salty. You can almost hear him chuckle as he wrote it. Then the tone changes. He says the sickness has reached the officers now, which means orders are fewer and confusion greater. Men wander from their bunks to the yard and back again, unsure of what to do. Marching drills have stopped entirely. The chaplain visits the infirmary more than the parade ground. It feels like the war has paused, he says. But the enemy here doesn't wait for truces. There's a line about a friend, though the name is smudged, perhaps from a drop of water or a shaking hand. The friend had been fine in the morning, laughing at some joke about the new recruits, but by evening he was in a cot, face pale and lips cracked. Your soldier says he sat beside him for a while, telling stories to fill the space between coughs. He seemed to drift away even while listening, the letter says. Halfway down the page, the handwriting begins to waver. The letters tilt unpredictably, and the spaces between words widen. You imagine him pausing often, perhaps leaning back, catching his breath before continuing. He mentions the sound of boots outside, slow and heavy, and the faint ring of a bell from somewhere in the yard. And then nothing. The sentence ends mid-phrase. The pen stroke drags downward into a faint line, thinner and thinner, until it fades entirely. No period, no signature, just an unfinished thought hanging in the air, forever suspended on that page. Historians still debate whether such letters were stopped by sudden weakness, interrupted by the arrival of the infirmary orderlies, or abandoned, as fever blurred the lines into meaninglessness. Whatever the reason, you're left holding not just a letter, but a moment caught in amber, the exact instant when words failed him. You stare at that unfinished sentence for longer than you mean to. You try to guess what might have come next. If I don't make it, if I could see you again, or perhaps something smaller, more ordinary. If I can get more paper, I'll write tomorrow. But you'll never know. That's the thing. About letters cut short, they give you a cliffhanger with no next page. Still, there's something oddly human about it. In a stack of full, carefully signed letters, this one feels the most alive, the most present. It's as if you can still feel the warmth of the moment it was written, and the sudden cold when it stopped. You fold it back along its crease, but your fingers linger at the edge, not ready to let go just yet. The envelope smells faintly of flour, as if it had travelled tucked beside a sack in someone's kitchen. The paper is thicker than usual, the handwriting pressed deep into the fibres, as though your mother's pen had to fight its way through the weight of the day. She begins not with the usual questions about your health, but with a list, short, brisk, and practical, of the things that have changed. Everyone wears masks now, she writes. Even Mrs. Clancy, and you know she's never liked anything covering her face, not even in winter. The image comes easily. Your small town's market square, usually a place of gossip and greetings, now a shifting sea of cloth-covered mouths. The bright patterns of aprons and skirts are still there, but the smiles are hidden. Instead of laughter, there's the muffled rustle of fabric as people speak through gauze. She says the schools are closed, and the children seem unsure whether to celebrate or worry. Some play in the yards, their voices high and unbothered, but others linger on porches, staring at the quiet streets as if the world has tilted slightly. Your cousin Daniel is trying to teach himself sums, she writes, and insists he's learned more in a week than in a year at school. I'm not so sure. You can almost hear her dry laugh in the sentence. Then come the cues: bread, medicine, coal, all in short supply. She describes them like different kinds of weather. The bread line is warm with the smell of baking, the coal line bitter with soot, the pharmacy line sharp with whispers about who's taken ill. She stands in them all, sometimes twice in a day. Your father says we should plant more turnips in the yard, she writes, but I think even turnips can't grow fast enough to keep us fed. Somewhere in the middle of the page, she mentions that the postmaster now wears gloves when handling letters, and keeps incoming mail in a wooden crate by the stove for 3 days to kill whatever rides in on the paper. She assures you she hasn't stopped writing, but admits she wonders how many of her letters actually reach you. There's a strange comfort in her describing the market in such detail. You can picture the stalls, the jars of pickles catching the light, the baskets of eggs wrapped in straw, the bolt of fabric she's been saving for curtains she might not sew for months. And you imagine the masks, all different, some neatly sewn from linen, others cut from old shirts, a few suspiciously like repurposed flour sacks. She writes that people have started judging each other's masks the way they once judged hats. A little competition in the middle of crisis. Historians still debate how much these homefront masks actually helped, or whether they were mostly a visible reminder to be careful. But in her words, you hear the relief they bring, however small. It makes me feel we're doing something, she says, even if it's only giving the sickness one more hurdle to clear. Near the end, her tone softens. She tells you about the neighbor's dog, who has learned to recognize her even with her face covered, and about the way the air smells sweeter now that fewer carriages and carts rattle through town. I keep thinking of the day you'll come home, she writes, and I'll walk to meet you in the square. I'll be wearing no mask, and you'll see my smile before you hear my voice. The letter closes neatly, her signature steady and familiar. You hold it for a moment longer, tracing the indentations of her handwriting with your thumb, and imagine the market's muffled hum, the lines winding down cobbled streets, and your mother's eyes, bright, determined, above a mask she didn't ask for, but wears anyway. The letter in your hands is heavier than it should be, as if the paper has soaked up the weight of what it carries. The soldier writes in a way that makes you feel the street under your own boots, the uneven cobblestones ringing faintly under a steady, slow tread. It's not his feet you're following, though it's the postman's. He describes the man as if he's part of the town's weather. Rain or frost, sun or fog, he moves down the same route, shouldering the same satchel, only now the leather strap digs deeper into his coat. He leans forward more these days. The letter says, like each envelope holds a brick. You picture him as the kind of figure children once ran toward, waving excitedly for news from uncles or brothers at the front. Now they hang back, on porches, unsure whether the letter he's carrying will bring a smile or a silence. Too sharp to fill. Your soldier notices that the postman no longer whistles between houses. Not because he's lost the habit, but because the streets are quieter now, and whistling would feel like shouting in a church. He keeps his eyes down, tipping his cap in greeting, but rarely meeting anyone's gaze for long. There's a stack of condolences in his bag today, and the weight of them bends his shoulders more than the cold ever could. The soldier writes of one morning when the postman paused by the fountain, setting his bag on the stone edge and resting his hands on his knees, not to tie his laces, not to check his route, just to breathe. A young boy offered him a biscuit, and he accepted it with a small nod, chewing slowly as if trying to make the moment last before he picked up the strap again. It's not just the death notices that wear him down. There are letters from soldiers, too ill to hold a pen for long, their handwriting slanting and uneven. There are requests for medicine that can't be filled, news of markets closing, instructions for funerals held with more empty chairs than mourners. And yet, folded among them, there are love letters, postcards from cousins, the occasional scrap of paper with nothing more than a joke and a sketch of a cat. These, the soldier says, are the only things that seem to lighten the postman's step. Some historians still debate whether postmen should have been spared from delivery during the height of the Spanish flu, quarantining mail until the danger passed. But reading this, you understand why the townspeople would never have allowed it. In a time when sickness and loss move faster than trains, the postman is more than a messenger. He's the thread holding the fabric of the street together, even as it frays. The soldier closes his letter with a line that stays with you. When he comes to our door, I think of you. Not because you might have written, but because I see the same quiet stubbornness in him that I imagine in you. We are both still here, carrying what we must. You fold the page slowly, feeling the echo of that satchel's weight in your own chest, and for a moment you swear you can hear the soft thud of boots on cobblestone heading toward another door. The paper feels softer now, worn at the folds, like it has traveled too far for too long. You run your thumb over the edge, and the ink has bled in places, smudged by damp or by a hand that didn't quite have the strength to hold steady. This letter isn't from the soldier whose words you've been hearing all this time. It's from his friend, one of the few left standing at the year's end. He writes with a kind of tired precision, like someone building a bridge one plank at a time, afraid a missing board will send the whole thing into the river. He starts by marking the date, the way you might mark a grave. It has been 1 year, he says, since we first heard the cough in the camp. And just like that, you feel the weight of every week between then and now. The friend recalls things you remember, but with the slight shifts that come when two people see the same moment from different sides. The muddy field where they played that brief football match. He says he still hears the shouts and the thud of the ball right before fever pulled half the players away. The converted barracks where the smell of medicine and unwashed wool hung in the air. He remembers the nurse's hands, trembling not from fear but from exhaustion. He names the ones who didn't make it home, not in a list, but in fragments of memory. A joke told in the rain, a song hummed in the dark, the way one man could fall asleep anywhere, even leaning against a supply crate. The letter pauses between each name, and you can almost hear the silence settle in And then, something you didn't expect. He writes about the flu, as if it were another soldier in their ranks. It marched with us, he says, faster than we could march away from it. He talks about how the sickness spared no uniform, moving from officer to private, from one bunk to the next. Some historians still debate whether it was the trenches or the troop trains that turned the Spanish flu into a storm across the world. But here, in his words, the cause doesn't matter as much as the way it stole time from them all. He admits he's writing not just for himself, but for the ones who can't anymore. Their stories, he says, are folded inside his own. When he leaves for home, if the trains still run, if the seas are safe, he will carry those stories back. I will tell them, he promises, even the parts that are hard to hear, because that is the only way they stay alive. There's a moment where the ink trails faintly, and you imagine him staring at the page for a long time, deciding what not to say. Maybe the memories are too sharp. Maybe the year is too heavy to fit inside paper and glue. But then the writing steadies again, and he signs it simply with his name and a line you know you'll remember. This year took much from us, but it will not take our voices. You sit with the letter in your lap, the quiet around you feeling full rather than empty, and you realize the friend is right. You've been carrying these voices too, all along. The stack of letters is lighter. Now you can feel it in your hands before you even count them. Only a few remain. The edges are feathered from handling, the paper thin enough that the light seems to seep right through. You turn one over, and the ink is pale, the lines breaking like waves that have traveled too far to reach the shore. With any force, the handwriting changes from page to page, sometimes neat, sometimes hurried, but in each there's a kind of slowing. The sentences grow shorter, the pauses between them longer. It's as if the letters themselves are learning to rest. One begins with an apology for not writing sooner, followed by a few lines about the weather, the food, a cough that has lingered. Another is just half a page, the ink faint at the edges, as if it had been set aside and never picked up again. And then there's one that has no words at all, only a pressed flower inside, brittle enough to crumble under your breath. Historians still debate which took more from those years, the war or the illness. But here, in your lap, it's clear they were never truly separate. The silence that follows the last letter feels like both an ending and a remembering. Outside your window, the day is fading. Shadows stretch and soften, like voices drifting. Beyond reach, you place the final letter back on the pile, the paper warm from your touch, and close the box. You breathe slowly. The details blur, the names, the dates, the sound of boots in mud, until only the feeling remains that you once held someone's voice in your hands. And even as it fades, it is still there, quiet, steady, waiting to be remembered when you next close your eyes. Now let the weight ease from your shoulders. Let the hush settle in your chest. You are safe here, and the night will keep watch. Drift as the voices drift, to where nothing hurts and nothing is urgent. Sleep will find you, gentle and sure. End of script. Sweet dreams.